Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre tonight for Claire Doherty's presentation. Claire Doherty is a very familiar person to many of us in Melbourne and Australia as a leading international curator and writer in the area of public art practice. Claire has had quite a long and established relationship in Australia and also New Zealand, first coming out here in 1996 on a curatorial fellowship. Claire is known as the founder of Situations, based in Bristol in the UK, which she started in 2002, and has developed an extensive program, both locally and internationally, of very ambitious and challenging public art projects that push our understanding of what public art can be, where it's produced, and importantly, the temporal nature of what we understand public art to be. Claire's also published quite extensively. Her books From Studio to Situation was published in the early 2000s. And more recently, last year, or 2015, she published Out of Time, Out of Place. That was an out of mind moment. Out of Time, Out of Place, Public Art Now. Claire has done a number of very interesting recent projects, some of which she'll cover tonight, including Theaster Gates' project Sanctum, which took place at the end of last year. But she'll go through a number of elements of her new rules of public art, including 3 that she wants to pick out and unfold in some more detail. Just before I welcome Claire to the stage, I did want to acknowledge the City of Melbourne, Deakin University and RMIT universities for the support for tonight's event, and in particular the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who have paid for Claire's visit to work with us on the Melbourne Biennial Lab. So could we please welcome Claire Doherty.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I am so delighted to be here. I'd particularly like to thank David Cross, Natalie King, Linda Roberts, and everyone at the Melbourne Biennial Lab. And I'd particularly like to thank the incredible artists that we've been working with for the last 10 days. If my voice goes a little bit hoarse, it's partly because we've had 10 days of intensive, incredible discussions at Queen Vic Market. It's very rare for me to get the chance for that kind of focused research and discussion with artists, and they have been so smart and so generous, and I'm very excited to see what they'll produce in October. So we have a bit of time together this evening to really kind of poke our fingers into the pie that is public art and to take the temperature of where things are at right now. Over the past 10 days, I've been really struck with the artist that maybe right now is the best of times and perhaps the worst of times to make public art. There's a reason behind that. We have an incredible diversity of publics and audiences that are confident and sophisticated and ready to be taken on the most amazing journeys across public space. Social media has enabled us to connect with people like never before. Cities such as Melbourne are truly investing in experimental practices. Artists who really want to push what's achievable out of conventional settings for art. But equally, this is a time, as we've seen in the last 2 days, of incredibly prejudiced ideas of what is acceptable in public space. We also see the encroachment of private interests on public space. And more, whenever I look at a commissioning brief that comes my way, for potentially for us to work on with an artist, the parameters are narrower and narrower and narrower. They're focused towards outcome. The value of art is often seen as embellishment, in some ways always focused on output, something shiny out front, which helps to brand a city or a locale. So it is the best and the worst of times to be making public art. So 3 years ago or so, Situations, which is the organisations that I direct in Bristol, we came up with a kind of rather tongue-in-cheek list of rules for public art. And it was partly based on the last decade of commissioning work. You know, one of those nights when you're kind of thinking, we really have to change things. And we'd been thinking about doing a souvenir brochure of all things, and it was deathly boring. And I said, there's got to be another way to talk about what we believe are the right conditions for artists to make work in public space. So we came up with 12 principles, which some of you may have heard me speak about before in Melbourne, which are, if you like, a kind of riposte to so often the expectations and assumptions about how artists can make work in public spaces. And I'm certainly not going to go through them all tonight, but I want to revisit 3 with you and just try and kind of dig into what's working and what's still a bit of a challenge, and to try and debunk some myths with you as well. Situations is an arts organisation. We don't have a building. We're a commissioning agency. We're funded by the Arts Council. And we commission all sorts of different projects, and they begin in many different ways. Sometimes we'll be working on a long-term public art programme for a city, perhaps write a strategy for that city. Others will initiate an invitation with an artist like Theaster Gates that we've always wanted to work with. We work with mentoring young artists. We work on highly spontaneous fleet of foot interventions and very long-term programs with youth groups. But we always work with other partners, often non-arts partners. So a really big part of what we try and do as producers is to find the language to describe the ways in which perhaps we could be commissioning work which actually looks entirely different than what perhaps first comes into your mind when you think of a public artwork, the Gormley. If I said public art to many of you, I'm sure the Gormley might feature somewhere in there in your mind's eye. And whenever I walk into a situation where there's a budget on the table, perhaps a developer's involved or a local authority or a city, Gormley usually comes into the conversation. I have to sort of gently move him off the table. But interestingly, I think it is something that can become a huge problem, a kind of cultural arms race, if you like, for various cities. Either Gormley or sort of giant inflatable ducks is usually one way or the other. But one of our first rules that we tried to that we did a lot of work around, that I'll move quickly on from really, was around the appearance of public art. It doesn't have to look like that public sculpture out front. And it might engage with place in quite complex and fleeting ways. Our work sits within a peer group of producers, many of whom are in Australia, such as Caldor Public Art Projects, for example, M Pavilion, another one in terms of their kinds of programme, Art Angel, Creative Time New York, National Theatre Wales. This was an amazing project by National Theatre Wales, which is a theatre company with no building, who stage a number of performances across Wales, site-specific performances. And this is the actor Michael Sheen enacting The Passion in the middle of a shopping mall. These are companies and agencies that really think about the nature of presenting and commissioning work in response to place. Places as always in a state of becoming, places not defined by some marketing, tourism, branded identity. And another aspect of quickly how we started to really talk about new forms of public art was this notion that it had to be permanent and durable and fixed and static to a single location. For example, many of you might have heard about Roger Hyons' amazing work commissioned by Art Angel, which used copper sulfate crystals, these extraordinary crystals that grow. And he covered the entire interior of an apartment with those crystals, as if walking into some sort of 6-year-old's incredible nightmare of Frozen. But an amazing work which changed constantly as you moved through it. It's now permanent work at Yorkshire Sculpture Park. So this idea of withdrawing from the cultural arms race, the commissioning of works which would get bigger, more monumental, more permanent, the kind of Anish Kapoor vision of the future of public space, is the alternative to that, or agencies such as Art Angel and Creative Time, and the kinds of works that we've seen, Paul Chan's Waiting for Godot in New Orleans, for example, that really very sensitively engage with the realities of living in those places. And they leave behind them an extraordinary sense of a temporary event which lives far longer in the minds of those residents in New Orleans than a permanent public memorial might have done. And finally, I think one of the other things that we found when we were doing that initial work about really trying to articulate how artworks, public artworks, might shift beyond that monumental idea was the idea of moving beyond using artists to produce wayfinders for a city. You won't believe how many times we've been asked for public sculpture trails, which effectively are kind of signage as you move through the city. As we know, artists are the best in helping us to get lost, in helping us to become disorientated, and in doing so, having an enriched experience of place. And often young people are much, much more interested in going on voyages of discovery than perhaps being guided from place to place by fixed artworks. This is a work by Blast Theory that involved a number of young people working with filmmakers in their locations across a city. Now, I wanted to explore from that 3 particular principles which I feel we might need to revise a little, or at least qualify. For many of artists in the audience and many critics or curators, you'll know that socially engaged art, that is, work or practices which engage with various publics through the process of making, have become over the last decade one of the most hotly contested areas of practice, and increasingly in our arts institutions are being embraced into the mainstream. But the problem with a lot of this work is there's a danger of the ethics of engagement encroaching on our idea of how the best artworks are created. Invariably, in our work in the last 10 years, we've worked with artists who are absolutely brilliant at engaging with their audiences or participants, of finding ways in which people can become part of the work as it unfolds. We've equally worked with artists who are simply not interested in that conversation and who are best supported to do so through the kinds of work that we do. And I think there are a great deal of debates about whether or not an artwork should provoke, antagonize, nurture, create positive outcomes or negative effects. And I just want to drill down into some of the ways in which we might make that a little bit more complex than good, bad outcomes. So one of the principles that we had was the idea of don't make it for a community, create a community. It comes from a Brian Eno saying in which he said perhaps the most important single aspect of a contemporary artwork is the creation of a temporary community. So the idea that artworks in themselves draw together different communities of interest. So often when I was working in the early 90s, there was a great debate about parachuting artists into particular, often socioeconomically deprived communities. More, that's now shifted and changed to the idea that a work can gather around it a community from very, very different kinds of networks of people. And perhaps that has a little bit more agency in it, creating something new out of the gathering of those people within it. To just drill down into how that happens, how as a producer you create a work that allows for those engagement to happen, I want to just refer to Theaster Gates's Sanctum project. Now this came about as a result of one of those many kinds of opportunities that come when you have a big cultural programme. Bristol was awarded European Green Capital, which effectively means in Europe it was seen as being one of the most progressive cities in regards to environmental sustainability. And it had a cultural programme that ran last year that was part of that. Now, it's very hard when you begin those kinds of negotiations around commissioning a new work, because invariably people will ask you, well, what are you going to work with recycled materials? And in fact, there were a number of kind of large whales that were made of recycled bottles, I think, and various things like that, which is sort of my sort of nightmare, but it has its place. We won't go there. But the person who I really started to think about when we were talking about the Green Capital was Theaster Gates. Theaster is an American artist based in Chicago. He trained as an urban planner and an architect and a potter. And he's become, his rise has been meteoric, really, in the last 5 years. He began by transforming these series of houses on the south side of Chicago where he lived, which were derelict, which was in a neighborhood that had very, very little cultural infrastructure. And using materials that were being thrown out from across the city, he transformed them into the most remarkable set of buildings, kind of a cultural hub that involved the listening house, which had the ex-vinyl records from a former Dr. Wax vinyl record store. It was clad in floorboards that were taken of houses that were being taken down. And he created an incredible cinema and employment for over 200 employees. So these were kind of living sculptures in the sense of creating a long-term regeneration area, but regeneration not in the sense of gentrification, but in the sense of transforming them through using materials that were deeply imbued with the history of Chicago. Now, this is someone who, therefore, apart from his work at Documenta in 2012, had rarely undertaken another public project. Instead, he was an art star. He's shown by White Cube Gallery, and his work goes for many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars. So he plays the art market, and he builds all of that income back into his Chicago project. So when we first started to work with Theaster, my central question was, what happens when you take someone that has that socially engaged practice that's embedded in his hometown, and you if you like, take that up and recontextualize it in an English city on the west coast of England? And the question really started to fall away when he first came to visit, and he said, so this town feels like it has everything going for it, Claire. Kind of, what can I do here that it hasn't got? He said, I'm so fed up of people coming to me and asking me to kind of regenerate little bits of their city. And he said, so what's missing? And Bristol is in good shape, but it's an incredibly segregated city. It has a central area which is mostly frequented by kind of middle-class organic food shoppers, and then has a range of different areas, all of which are very vibrant, but there isn't much movement between those areas. And there's also a very conscious sense in which it has a very rich cultural ecology, but not a great deal of space for people to have their voices heard. There's a lot of kind of ways in which there's a kind of an official culture and then an underground culture. This is the city where massive attacks started in Portishead and Banksy. So there's something about the city's independent spirit that needs to kind of kick against its institutional past. And he picked up on that. So we found this ruin of a church, which was owned by English Heritage, but hadn't been open for 75 years. It was bombed in a night blitz of 1945 and had been shut ever since, mainly because it was dangerous to people walking in. And he said it's very interesting that there are these kinds of shells of former faiths and gathering. He's a very religious man himself, and he was interested in, what are now the spaces of sanctuary in this city, spaces of congregation, spaces of contemplation. And we initially started to talk about building an architectural shell, and what in fact he built using materials from all over the city was this inner sanctuary, quite a small kind of pavilion-like space. And it was all built by hand because we couldn't take any cranes or any of that kind of hardware in, by this Bristol-based team. So the beams came out of a sugar warehouse that was owned by a former slave trader, and you could still smell the sugar resin as you walked in. It's incredible smell. The doors of the structure were brought in from a chocolate factory that had just closed down. The floor from a school gym, and the windows from Georgian houses. So it had a very particular kind of domestic quality. Bristol's not a post-industrial city, it's pre-industrial. So the architecture there is very particular. So it didn't look like Dorchester projects. It looked like Bristol, it smelt like Bristol. And these histories in this structure collided into this one particular space. Now, had we just done this peculiar architectural intervention within this former heritage site, that would have been one thing, would have been interesting, would have been an interesting contemporary art, public art intervention. But of course that wasn't Theaster. What he was really interested in is how this space, sort of lit from beneath, would actually come alive for the 24 days that it was open. And he began by talking about using this as a platform, an intimate space into which people would come and spend time, open 24 hours a day, non-stop. And he said, well, of course, one of the things around sanctuary and around places of gathering is that they're sustained by sound, they're sustained by performance, by voice, often by those whose voices are not heard elsewhere. And so we began. We began by setting ourselves some rules, which was that we would sustain the sound of Sanctum from the moment it opened on the 29th of October to the moment it shut for 24 days, 552 hours continuously. And we would do so by inviting whoever would like to perform in it to take part. And there were just some parameters. You either had to live in Bristol or be visiting the city during those few weeks. So we weren't going to fly in a kind of festival type program. So we had the most extraordinary range of 700 performers. And each time they overlapped. So there was no kind of set program and set up time in between. So you had this amazing guy who was the world-famous banjo player segueing into a young heavy metal band who had only played in their bedroom, through to a gospel choir, through to a young singer-songwriter, through to a spoken word artist at 3 a.m. And what was extraordinary is after 2 days, these cues started to form. There was a sense of wanting to bear witness to this thing going on. And a very, very important part of Sanctum was that the program remained secret. So you never knew what you were going to hear. And what was very interesting about it is that it called to it a congregation of people coming back, and the rhythm of the day was revealed through it as it merged through. This is just some of the people who were, this is an amazing artist called Sarah Zoltash, who sang the call to prayer, Muslim call to prayer, every day for 1 hour. Some extraordinary people taking part and playing. And I'm just going to play you a little thing from Theaster himself.
Sanctum is a most sacred space inside of a sacred space on the ruins of the Temple Church. We built an inner sanctuary inside those ruins where the city of Bristol could perform for 552 hours. So as I was approaching the structure, I was a little bit anxious because I hadn't seen it complete. And I saw its doors and I saw the kind of quirkiness, and it feels more Bristol than maybe anything that I could make on my own. And it's been that kind of mashup of parts of Bristol, people in Bristol that Bristol didn't know. And it felt like the more we were able to tap into Bristol's talent, the better the work became. Part of the value of listening to each other is that you start to realize that your voice is actually connected to a ton of voices that are interested in the same things. There's just been no connectivity apparatus. And I think that Sanctum and Situations was, at least for this moment, attempting to be that apparatus. And so I've been excited to learn how to create platforms that allow for that kind of connectivity so that the challenges of our cities are resolved because people listen longer and sing louder and try harder to know each other.
Child of God, although I move so slow,
And they had such a beautiful time playing and dancing upon the light, enjoying the wonderful radiant colours around.
Art, it only works when people believe in it. I'm here because of an artist who believes in the power of publics. I feel like I've participated in something amazingly public in Bristol that may have kind of slightly changed my life. We've been able to do something that feels much more fulfilling, much larger than our individual efforts. It's like all those things together conspire to make an amazing 552 hours.
So it was an extraordinary thing, but I think one of the things that I'd like to emphasise is that it's not easy creating a platform for multifarious voices, and Theaster was very clear that you set some structure in place and that allows for participation. There's a project called Fun Houses in the UK, and it has a much more broader open-ended idea of coming and participating and taking part and having fun. And I think I'd like to emphasise that there were moments of extreme discord in Sanctum. There were moments when people were faced with performance or views or the type of music that they didn't enjoy. And there was something around being subjected or entering into a space that didn't feel comfortable that was very, very important. It also became important for us to think about a remote audience, as in many of our projects. And so digital resources are a really key way in which we try to provide some depth to an experience so people can also upload their own thoughts and their own creative responses. This is, you can see here, the Tumblr site that then took off in regards to Sanctum, people finding out more and more information and wanting to contribute their own views. And those edges of the project of where you control as a producer, where you have to kind of let go, this Sanctum was a really big creative collaboration for us. These are some of the other drawings and sketches that came out of young people working with us over long periods of time on this particular project. But many other artists wouldn't necessarily collaborate in the way in which Theaster did with us. We were far more creative collaborators and producers. And I think his is a very generous practice. But what was interesting in how really time was an essential quality to how Sanctum's success. And it's something that David and I have worked on for a very long period of time, of thinking of public time as well as public space. What I mean by that is understanding how a work might unfold over time, as well as to be experienced in an instant or in a permanent state. Many of you will know about our project One Day Sculpture, which was a series of 24-hour artworks over the course of a year. There were 20 projects over 5 cities in New Zealand. And certainly in 2008-09, we did a great deal of thinking around the temporary intervention and as a kind of alternative to permanent public art commissioning. But as I've moved through with David some of that work, we both feel that there's a kind of a more complex way of approaching public time, other than suggesting, for example, it be a 12-hour barricade, or have a kind of very temporary fleet-of-foot intervention to have impact. In fact, what I think more and more artists are asking for is their work is experienced over time through a series of different kinds of encounters and experiences. And as commissioners, that's a tough thing because you have to invest in a project that's going to unfold. It's going to require more resources, more engagement, more support over much longer periods of time. It's an entirely different working method than if you're commissioning or curating within a gallery, where the work is done and you open it and then you let it go. In our case, many of our projects need the care, that duty of care of a producer over much long periods of time. For example, this is the shores of the fjord in the city of Oslo, where we worked for 5 years, working on a range of different projects, but we spent 2.5 years working with the city to understand how projects might unfold over much long periods of time. They originally commissioned a sculpture trail, and in fact what we produced with them was 2 projects, one of which will last for 100 years. So I don't think they quite knew what they had signed up to when they started out with us. But as an example, we work with these amazing artists and activists called Future Farmers, and entering into that space of the corporate redevelopment of the harbour side in Oslo was quite a big ask for them. They're artists who object to and want to advocate for a commons, a publicly owned space. But we managed to, with their help, find a way for them to really create a work that was hugely productive. And it began with what I often find is quite useful in public art commissioning, which is a decoy, essentially. We began with the proposal for a public bakehouse, a permanent public bakehouse, an area you could take your dough to and learn how to cook bread, and on the shores of the fjord. But in fact, what began with that project is we began by giving away 300 allotments to people who'd never been to that area of Oslo before, from the eastern side of Oslo. And over that period of time, through those negotiations, and you can see here the temporary bakehouse that we used as a kind of way of testing out how the site might work, and on the right-hand side, the allotments are just forming. We used that as a way to test out actually how the artist might gain ownership for the public of this piece of land in perpetuity. And they used flatbread as a kind of currency to get to know who might be interested in becoming involved in this project. They worked with farmers, they worked with bakers, they got to know all the different kinds of parts of Bristol. And having this kind of flatbread as a means of talking about culture was incredibly useful to get under the skin of the place, as opposed to parachuting in with their idea. And eventually, you won't be able to read this, but it resulted in this, which is a declaration of the use of land in Bjørvika in perpetuity for as a cultural commons for the production of food. So that piece of land is now protected from urban development going forward. And they're very, very clever how they use really kind of extraordinary visual triggers. They ploughed the fields using an ancient technique just to trigger that sense of the change of use in land from the kind of building that was going on around. And just scooting through, the other project that we've commissioned as part of Oslo is called Future Library, which is a 100-year project. In 2014, we planted 1,000 trees just outside of the city, which will grow over the next 100 years to maturity. And every year for the next 100 years, a writer will write a text that remains unread until 2114. And at that point, the trees will be cut down. They'll have reached maturity by then, and a series of books published with these 100 texts within them. The manuscripts that are unread are being held by the new library that's being built on the shores of the fjord. And the first writer was Margaret Atwood, the second writer was David Mitchell. And you can imagine, I'm not going to play you the film of Margaret Atwood actually, just because we're running out of time, but you can imagine for a writer, we initially thought, this might be crazy, a writer's not going to respond to this in terms of not having their work published during their lifetime or during our lifetime, or even those of our children's. But in fact, it was a huge freedom. Margaret Atwood said, fantastic, my editor and my agent won't get to read it. For that project, if you can imagine pitching that to the city of Oslo, it's a project that's about our future. It's our future generation, and we'll get to experience this work. But of course, if you say to a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, could you write something that someone's going to read in 100 years? It absolutely captures their imagination. And so many of these works, importantly, the education and engagement programs that we build around them are capturing those ideas. often future developments such as Bjørvika in Oslo are about a future city, a future imagined city. And the 5th floor of the library is where now the precious books are held, because climate change is likely to flood the 1st floor. So we know that these buildings and developments are being developed according to the future that we have at hand. And what better than to have the most extraordinary writers over the next 100 years being commissioned. Now, to make that work, that project took 2 years of convincing and the setting up of a trust, and the public art funds that had been put aside for that public artwork were put into trust. And now every 5 years, there'll be new trustees who take that forward, and the artist remains a trustee for the rest of her life. So it requires huge leaps of faith, these kinds of works. Whether it's English heritage as part of Sanctum, you have to be really brave. You have to be really agitating what people expect there to be in terms of the kinds of outcomes that we can produce. And so often, finally, we often find that what's expected of public artworks is that they will be spectacular. Either in terms of large-scale mass audiences, which I'm a great sucker for fireworks, but public artworks can do so much more in regards to recognising the dissenting and different voices that we have in our communities and our societies. And of course, public artworks also don't always tell the truth, as we can see from the Batman Memorial up at Queen Victoria Market and the subsequent almost indiscriminate text underneath it. So we know that actually in terms of history, commemoration and memorials, to try and create a work that marks the history of something is a very, very difficult job. We were asked last year or just the year before last, to commission an artist to commemorate the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. There's an amazing site just south of London, which is under the flight path of Heathrow. It's about a mile from Heathrow, but it's preserved as an English meadow because that is where the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. There's in fact an incredible tree there called the Ankerwick yew, which is 2,000 years old, and I love the idea that that tree was 1,200 years when the Magna Carta was signed. The Magna Carta has extraordinary international implications in terms of this clause, Clause 39, which was the clause that went on to establish child by jury, which is that no man will be judged other than by his peers. It was in fact a way of the barons wresting power away from the king. But subsequently, to commission an artwork that would somehow commemorate this state occasion was a very difficult ask. And in fact, we've commissioned 2 works, one which was last year by the artist Hugh Locke, and the next which will be next year by Mark Wallinger. But I just wanted finally just to refer you to something that occurred during this. And this is a bit of an example of what you can do in those circumstances. So we actually commissioned a bronze public sculpture, can you believe? David's jaw has just dropped onto the floor. And what it was a series of 12 chairs which sat directly, not on a plinth, but on the grass, as if they were a meeting point. And each of the chairs were intricately worked with symbols and drawings and scratches and words, each of which represented a particular area of human rights in the last 800 years. And Hugh Locke created this absolutely extraordinary series of objects, but they could only really be activated through the public sitting down, as if they were sitting as a jury to meet and to gather. That in itself was an extraordinary work, and it has had the most I'll just flip through, but the most brilliant responses. Here you can see here Helen Gibson and Banjo Nick, who visited, and there's just sitting by the boab tree, have I said that right? Which is the prison tree, which is shown on one of the chairs. So it's had the most extraordinary response, but we knew that this work would be launched as part of a state occasion, and we knew that Prince William was going to come and sit in one of the chairs. And so it was one of the weirdest launches of a public artwork I've ever been involved with. It was a kind of mash-up between Parliament, royals, and then some big papier-mâché heads with school kids kind of singing choirs of Magna Carta. It was very, very odd. But what we knew that there would be 5,000 people there from across the world. And so, as a way of activating the work, we commissioned the Welsh writer Owen Shears to write a dedication which would be performed by a series of performers chosen from many, many different artists, many of whom were refugees, who would walk through the crowds, through the seated audience of 5,000, to the chairs, and be seated with Prince William. And what resulted was quite extraordinary. This is the point at which they sat down, and I don't know whether you happen to know about royal etiquette, but you essentially don't sit with a royal also seated. So we'd also already managed to breach that one. But as you can see, Edson Burton, the spoken word artist here, is sitting at the head of the jury with Prince William on his left. And I'm just going to play you finally what went out over the crowd that day, which is an example of an intervention of a diversity of voices and thoughts, and the way in which perhaps artists have the capability to represent very, very different publics through that.
In every human beating breast, the love of freedom lives. Impatient of oppression's print, it pants deliverance, which only words that break cement have the power to give.
But words are weak as well as strong. They die upon the air, and commerce can enslave the heart that once was feathered fair. For in the middle passage, who will hear? Who will care?
But words are strong as well as weak, like carvings on a tree. They sing to those who mark them down and those still yet to be. For humanness is in the look as much as in the sea.
And like the piano tuner who stalks his temperament, so we can seek our equal notes, our words to represent. For knowledge is like water held without the words to vent.
And whatever heaven you hold within your body or in your head, its light is in the people's eyes, despite oppression's lead. The only prison is fear, fear of what is said.
Yet each man kills the things he loves. The stricken ship spills its oil upon the sea that made it whole. So we will tear and spoil the best of us that makes us man, the best that makes us royal.
Even now we become unmoored, cast off our best creation, like throwing children overboard. But the rules of a nation is hardy, grained within our wood, in spite of what we've done.
And not just for men, but women too, however well they are dressed. For what is the law that only applies to half of us? A scar, that's what, upon itself, again become a loss.
But words are strong as well as weak, and in their death revive. Their light shines through the senses' ink. When torn, they still survive. For freedom looks towards the sun, so in the darkness thrives.
So laws are words, and words are us, and speech has set us free. But what when laws become our chains in name of liberty? When mouths are watched and tongues are cut, how then does justice see?
A dancing leader needs the lead, their heart as well as hand. And in this way, justice can live, and we can make our ground with words and witness, till all we sought can now be found.
And should a bullet pierce the brain, its thoughts will still live on. And all the more if those ideas are grown from us, hand-spun. So this is how our justice flows, and this is how it's won.
So this is how our justice flows, and this is how it's won. With strength of mind and strength of word, and in 1,000 tongues. A tale of us and not of you, across the nation sung.
Yes, this is how our justice flows, and this is how it's won.
A tale of us and not of you, across the nation sung.
This is how our justice flows, and this is how it's won.
So if you can imagine that playing out across the thousands of visitors there, with those performers moving through the crowd and then seating themselves in those chairs, it was quite an extraordinary thing, particularly as our Prime Minister Cameron had claimed Magna Carta as England's own, to hear these voices, very diverse voices, speaking about this is how our justice flows and this is how it's won, a tale not of you. Very markedly about seizing that power for the people. So, in conclusion, I think my feeling is that we have a challenge ahead to create the conditions in which artists have the chance to provoke, to make us feel uncomfortable, to challenge our preconceptions of what our future might hold. And yet, as producers, we have to find ways in which this work is relevant. There is no future for us working within the confines of an art market, or the confines of an arts-centred media, or the confines of art prizes. That is simply not where the public are interested. They will go away and be entertained and provoked and enlivened by other art forms if we don't respond to the changes that we're seeing in public spaces. So my challenge to the City of Melbourne is to embrace new forms of public art. It may not be forever, but there are simply the most wonderful, wonderful ways in which you can create spaces for artists to contribute to this extraordinary place. Thank you.
Claire, we could take this many different directions. There's a lot of material in your presentation. I wonder whether it might be an interesting place to start to reflect on your thoughts around temporary communities and the way in which I think in the last 10 years you've increasingly, in a sense, nuanced your engagement with how you formed communities across the projects, from One Day Sculpture through to Black Cloud, through to the Astor's project. Can you maybe share with us some of the kind of thinking that you've discovered about what it is to form an organic but profound temporary community?
Well, maybe I could just talk to, maybe this is something we pick up in the questions, but talk to one of the problems of the ethics of forming a community. So there's a notion that sustainable is good, and there must be a legacy for a project. So I think there's two things going on with that assumption. One is that any producer or curator worth their salt is going to take care. So whatever you set up in terms of expectations or relationships, you have to take care of those. You can't just exit and leave whatever chaos behind. So in the case of Sanctum, there was very much a strong sense in which we connected people and we kind of talked to people about what it meant for Sanctum to go. It was very important that that structure got taken away, so that whatever gap it left behind might be taken up. And a big part of our role there has then been to be at various other meetings across the city to talk about what actually that gap exposed and how we might support other groups and funding to take place. That said, which is sort of best practice, there's also something very important to say. Temporary encounters and temporary communities are no bad thing, and that's really how society works. I'm sure it's many of your experience that if you've become involved in particular projects, whether it be a young band when you're young, or a particular group or a particular kind of allotment, whatever it might be, they are fleeting, and they don't last for years and years and years. So there's something around the connections that are created between people, and perhaps those come together for a particular time.
And I'm struck by your conversations around the Astor's project at the point at which you felt the Bristol community started to take ownership of that space.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm interested about the idea of time in that, in terms of the fact that the project ran for as long as it did. How do you see the connection between time and that kind of richness of community that you're looking to establish?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's something we found in our work, isn't it? Is that there's something around letting something unfold and be different in the unfolding that then allows for a far richer experience. So, I mean, there's very few performances or visual art exhibitions or any art form for many of us that we would go back, that we'd want to see it twice. It's a really good thing if you do, twice or more. But often, you know, you buy your ticket or you go in to see the exhibition. I've done it, that was, you know, that remains. You don't necessarily have an ongoing relationship to revisit and see it differently or see it unfold. So I think there's something very interesting that happens at different times of the day, so how it unfolds over a day, but also how it unfolds over time. And what was very interesting around Theaster's project was very quickly, once he had sort of departed, he was there for the first 5 days, people just referred to it as sanctum. It was a place, sanctum, as opposed to Theaster Gates's project. Before he arrived, before it opened, it was Theaster Gates's project. But very quickly, it had its own rhythm and its own time. Yeah, and what I'm sure this has happened a lot here, where there's a successful project or a successful architectural structure, or perhaps a public artwork that we've noticed with quite a few of our works, like Nowhere Island, which was this floating island nation. You get cultural gifting going on. So people turn up with gifts for the projects. So that happened a lot in Sanctum. People would come and leave things at the door. And yeah.
Just, I will open it up to the floor because I know we're kind of time constrained. But a couple of questions, maybe just coming back to your initial provocation around these are the best of times and the worst of times for public art. I know that's slightly throwaway.
Dickensian.
But at the same time, let's just kind of unpack that slightly. Why is it a good time for public art? What is it now? Is it about, you were sort of outlining a more mature audience, an audience that's maybe more interested in risk and experimentation and being pushed, but are there other factors in train in terms of why this is a good time for public art?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's culturally specific. I mean, there's not a particularly good time for public art in Morocco at the moment, you know, because there's various different conditions of public space there. So let's say in Melbourne right now, it's a very good time for public art because we're ready. Yeah, we're ready. You have a new generation of young people that are reading public space in a completely different way. They connect in completely different ways. They are so image savvy. They're desperate to be visually stimulated, you know. So it's thirsty, this audience, and they're exploring in ways they never have done before. So I think that's incredibly exciting. And I think you've also got here a very sophisticated city infrastructure and a city council who are really ready to embrace something other than a Biennale. You know, I think having come from Sydney, I think it's time to move out of that exhibition format. So it feels like a really good time to be, you know, commissioning something that's other than a festival too, that encourages the audiences to go to things that they haven't booked for. I think one of the things around public art is your incidental audience. We've talked a lot about that with artists in the last week. So not only those audiences that have decided to go and encounter that work, but who happen to pass it on the way home and go, what the hell is that? You know, or maybe those market traders that we've been working with, just working with artists. I mean, what an extraordinary thing. So that feels very exciting, yeah.
It's a sort of very elegant segue perhaps to discuss the reason that you are here, which is the Melbourne Biennial Lab, which Claire and I have been co-convening over the last 9 days. Might be an interesting moment to kind of capture for the audience here what we've been doing and what's going to be unfolded. So.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, we've been lucky enough to be involved for 10 days with the artists who've been selected for the Biennial Lab, which will take place in the middle of October as part of not Manchester International Festival, that would be daft, Melbourne International Festival. And really, why it's very exciting and experimental is that what normally happens with the Public Art Commission is you would perhaps invite the artist, You get a proposal, you work on the site together, you get to know the place through a series of site visits, and that artist operates primarily on their own, even if it's a group project. And then ultimately the projects are kind of put together, and potentially, it's a scattered site exhibition, and the artists might not even meet each other until the opening. In this case, what Natalie and David and the crew at Public Art Melbourne have set up is a collective experience of research. So they have been delving into the histories and lived experiences of Queen Victoria Market, which are hugely complex, and the potential future of it, together. Which means that whilst they're working on their proposals, they're also having the opportunity to see what each other are doing and to talk to us about previous experiences. So it's a very intense but really, really rich way of getting under the skin of a place.
Oh, hello. I just have a question about community involvement and any kind of frictions you might have found with various sectors of the community and how you might have dealt with them. I know it's a very open question, but in all the various sort of impermanent events that you've organised, for instance, in Bristol and the church.
It's a difficult question to ask broadly, because we've worked in all sorts of different kinds of contexts all over the UK, and they're usually not what you would expect. That's what I would firstly say. So nobody has a problem with doing something in a ruined church for some reason, but they might. No one had a problem with the noise. So all the scenario planning we did around noise, pollution, no problem at all. And then there would be something like an objection to the Buddhist chanting. So quite a lot of it is really rolling with it and being open to having discussions around particular things. I'd say that there's probably more, I don't want to go and take too long on it, but there's probably more interesting frictions that come through slightly more provocative work. So we did this work by the artist Michael Salesdorfer, in which he buried gold under the sand of a beach in a town called Folkestone on the southeast coast of England. And it was completely secret. And the work was part of a triennial, like a kind of scattered site public art project. And the town itself has been has taken art to its heart, really. So it's kind of ready for anything. But this work was probably the closest to a kind of provocative event we've ever done. So we were very conscious of what might unfold. But what was really interesting was that the friction actually came from the media, and particularly arts media, in what they thought was going to happen. So no one knew about it until till the first day of the show, and a press release went out saying that 50 pieces of gold had been buried under the sand, totaling £10,000, and then a gold rush ensued, essentially, as you'd imagine. But what was very interesting was that all the people from London, like me, dressed in black, and the art critics, sort of stood over the beach watching. There were only a few of them, and Adrian Searle, the Guardian critic, said, there's going to be a riot, people will be smashing each other over the heads. And of course that's not what happened at all. What actually happened was that people were really up for it, and they were really serious about finding the gold, but not in a kind of desperate, greedy way, in a really playful way. And so there were these massive guys with metal detectors, proper bikers who kind of arrived. But we'd buried metal washers as well, so that didn't happen. Who were talking to the young kids with their spades and lending them metal detectors. And I don't want to kind of give the impression that everyone was sort of suddenly a happy family, but there was something going on which was very interesting, which was sharing digging techniques. And then when someone did find one, my God, people were so thrilled. They were just so utterly thrilled. And it happened to be a 12-year-old boy who then asked me whether or not he had to tell his mum because he wanted to buy a BMX bike with it and not give it to his mum. But it was very interesting, and there was subsequently a Guardian article in which people said, it's the most deprived area of one of the most deprived areas, and, you know, is it about greed? And yes, of course it's about greed. It's a really provocative work. It's about the fact that, you know, what are you going to do when you bury gold under the sand of a beach? But it actually turned it on its head and becomes something else, where in fact it's a permanent work, in that not all of the gold has been found, and that beach forevermore is kind of the gold beach. And it's the way the media worked, and the town took it to its heart. So like some of the cafes renamed themselves gold cafes and all the rest of it. So, you know, that is a very, but it was a sort of extreme work for us to do. But I think that in a case of friction is probably the closest we've got to it.
People, unfortunately, we are out of time. I feel like we've only just glazed the surface of some fantastic material. I did want to just finish in saying that we're very hopeful that we'll have Claire back in Australia to develop some projects in the near future. We've been trying for many years. I think we're getting closer each time, but it's been a delight to have her here. Could we thank Claire Doherty, please?
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.